a TikTok star with millions of views, adored for his flashy lifestyle. But behind the filters and fame lay a darkness no one could predict. Terrion Ishmael Thomas, better known to his fans as Mr. Prada, built his online persona on extravagance. His TikTok clips showed him dressed in designer clothes, flashing expensive accessories, and radiating an aura of confidence. For thousands scrolling through their feeds, he was the embodiment of ambition and success. His videos attracted attention not only because of his style, but also because of his larger-than-life personality. Mr. Prada was bold, outspoken, and sometimes erratic, qualities that kept audiences hooked. Yet, in the background, those close to him noticed troubling signs. Thomas had spoken openly online about struggling with mental health, mentioning a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. His behavior often swung between grandiose highs and unsettling lows. Still, for most viewers, the entertainment value overshadowed any warning signs. Fame, after all, has a way of concealing cracks beneath the surface. As his online popularity grew, Thomas began projecting himself as untouchable. He thrived on attention, basking in the constant validation that likes, comments, and shares provided. But the spotlight that once seemed empowering was also isolating. Behind closed doors, his life was not as glamorous as it appeared on screen. He lived alone in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a modest apartment far from the luxury image he cultivated online. And it was inside that very apartment that the story would shift from digital fame to real-world horror. The place that had been a backdrop for his flashy TikTok videos would soon become a crime scene, to me. This is the chilling reminder of how easily social media masks reality, hiding the chaos and violence waiting just out of frame. No one who watched Mr. Prada dance, laugh, and pose online could have imagined that his name would soon be tied not to fashion or fame, but to murder. A man trusted by many for his wisdom and guidance. Yet whispers of a dark past followed him into the present. Dr. William Nicholas "Nick" Abraham had spent decades building a reputation in Baton Rouge as a reliable and insightful therapist. At 69 years old, he had seen countless patients walk through his doors, seeking advice, treatment, or simply a safe place to unburden themselves in the community. Abraham was known as calm, attentive, and deeply professional. For many, he was a figure of comfort, a man whose role was to heal emotional wounds. But Abraham's story was not without controversy. In 2015, allegations had surfaced accusing him of inappropriate conduct with an 11-year-old boy. The claims were disturbing and cast a long shadow over his otherwise respectable career. Ultimately, prosecutors decided there wasn't enough evidence to move forward, and Abraham avoided criminal charges. Still, the accusations lingered like a ghost in his biography, never fully proven, yet never completely forgotten. By 2024, Abraham continued to see clients, maintaining his career despite the unresolved stain on his record. To outsiders, he appeared steady and committed, continuing his practice with the same soft-spoken demeanor. His days were filled with routine sessions, professional meetings, and the quiet rhythms of a therapist's life. Nothing about his schedule suggested that he was about to step into a nightmare. On that fateful morning, Abraham made his way to the Baton Rouge apartment of Terrion, Mr. Prada Thomas. The reason for his visit remains unclear, whether it was personal, professional, or something in between. What is known is that security cameras recorded him entering Thomas's building. From that moment forward, he would never be seen alive again. And this is where I can't help but pause. The image of a respected doctor stepping calmly into danger without realizing it feels like the cruelest twist of fate. What began as an ordinary visit soon spiraled into an encounter that would leave one man dead and another branded a murderer. One ordinary morning. Two men crossed paths inside a quiet Baton Rouge apartment, and only one of them would ever leave alive. The morning seemed unremarkable. Neighbors later recalled the stillness of the apartment complex, the faint hum of cars passing on the nearby road, and nothing that suggested violence was about to unfold. At approximately 10 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Dr. William Nick Abraham walking into the building. He appeared calm, carrying nothing more than a small bag, perhaps papers or personal items, to anyone watching. It looked like a casual visit, one he had likely made before. Inside, Terrion Mr. Prada Thomas was waiting. The young TikTok star had been posting erratically in the days prior, his content swinging from playful to unsettling. Some followers even noticed his tone shifting, his jokes sharper, his words edged with frustration. Whether Abraham came that morning as a friend, a professional, or for some other purpose remains unknown. But behind the closed door of Thomas's apartment, the dynamic quickly changed. Accounts pieced together by investigators suggest that an argument erupted. Voices were heard through the walls, shouting, movement, the unmistakable signs of a struggle. What exactly triggered it is unclear. Was it a clash of personalities, a buried grievance, or something darker, tied to Abraham's controversial past? What is clear is that the confrontation escalated rapidly. The sound of heavy thuds followed. Neighbors described hearing a loud crash, as if furniture had been knocked over. Then silence, an unnatural, suffocating quiet. For those living nearby, it was the kind of moment that made them pause, uneasy but unsure whether to intervene. And this is where I can't help but reflect. The terrifying reality of true crime is how violence can erupt in the most ordinary settings, transforming a quiet apartment into a battlefield in mere minutes. By the time the struggle ended, Dr. Abraham was no longer breathing inside that apartment. Mr. Prada had crossed a line from internet fame to infamy, setting in motion a chain of events that would soon horrify the entire community. Behind the door of a seemingly ordinary home, investigators would later uncover a scene soaked in violence. When detectives finally entered Terrion, Mr. Prada Thomas's Baton Rouge apartment, what they found erased any doubt that a horrific crime had unfolded inside. The living room, once a backdrop for flashy TikTok dances and lighthearted skits, was transformed into a grisly scene. Blood stained the carpet and splattered across the walls, painting a picture of a struggle that was both prolonged and brutal. Furniture was overturned. A chair had been smashed against the wall, leaving dents in the plaster. Investigators discovered several sharp objects scattered around the space, items consistent with weapons that could have caused lethal injuries. Each detail told a silent story of panic, rage, and violence spiraling far beyond control. Forensic teams noted that attempts had been made to clean parts of the apartment. Paper towels, stained and discarded, were found in the trash. Bleach had been poured in certain areas, leaving sharp chemical odors lingering in the air. It was a hasty, desperate effort to erase what had happened. But the scale of the blood loss was far too great to conceal. Every corner of the room bore witness to what Abraham had endured in his final moments. Neighbors later confirmed hearing noises earlier in the day, shouting, banging, then silence. None of them could have imagined that only feet away, a man's life was being violently taken. The apartment, a place once associated with an online persona of glamour and humor, now stood as undeniable evidence of murder. And here is where my own reaction crystallizes. Nothing exposes the gap between online fantasy and real-life horror more than walking into a crime scene that once doubled as a stage for social media fame. For investigators, the scene was clear. Mr. Prada had not only been present during Abraham's death, he was at the center of it. The apartment had become both a sanctuary of celebrity and a prison of guilt. When neighbors saw a bulky object wrapped tightly in a tarp, they never guessed they were witnessing the disposal of a human life. In the hours after the struggle, Terrion Mr. Prada Thomas faced a grim reality. The lifeless body of Dr. William Nick Abraham lay inside his apartment. What happened next revealed both calculation and desperation. Investigators believe Thomas dragged the body across the blood-stained floor, wrapping it hastily in a large plastic tarp. The sound of heavy scraping echoed through the hallway as he attempted to maneuver the bundle down the stairwell. Neighbors later recalled seeing Thomas struggling with the awkward, weighted object. One described it as something too big and too heavy to be anything ordinary. Another remembered the strong odor of chemicals lingering in the hall, likely from the bleach Thomas had used in his failed cleanup. Yet at the time, few questioned him directly. In apartment complexes, people often look the other way, not wanting to involve themselves in what might seem like personal matters. Security footage from the building corroborated their accounts. Thomas was captured dragging the tarp-wrapped body into the parking lot, then loading it into Abraham's own vehicle. The sight of a respected doctor's remains reduced to an anonymous package thrown into the back of a car was almost too horrific to process. He then drove toward Tangipahoa Parish, a rural area east of Baton Rouge. It was there, along a desolate roadside, that Abraham's body would eventually be discovered, discarded like refuse. His life ended and his dignity stripped away. For me, this moment is the most chilling. The casual disposal of a human being as if he were nothing more than trash. A reflection of cruelty at its rawest. By the time the tarp was found and identified, the story had already shifted from mystery to manhunt. The internet star known for his lavish persona was now the prime suspect in a crime both calculated and cold. With a body abandoned on a lonely roadside, the killer turned his focus to escape, fleeing across state lines in a stolen car. After discarding Dr. William Nick Abraham's body in Tangipahoa Parish, Terry on, Mr. Prada Thomas did not return to his Baton Rouge apartment. Instead, he climbed into Abraham's own vehicle, a deliberate choice that investigators would later describe as reckless, driving the victim's car. Thomas attempted to put distance between himself and the crime scene, heading west before eventually steering toward Texas. Along the route, surveillance cameras and license plate readers picked up the vehicle. At gas stations, witnesses recalled a young man fitting Thomas's description, restless and hurried, keeping his head low as if trying not to be recognized. The once flamboyant TikTok star, who thrived on being the center of attention, now seemed consumed by paranoia. For authorities, the evidence trail was clear. They already had security footage from the apartment complex, proof of Abraham entering the building, but never leaving, and recordings of Thomas hauling the tarp-wrapped body into the parking lot, combined with the abandoned body. The case was quickly narrowing to one suspect. All they had to do was follow the car. In Dallas, Texas, officers finally tracked Thomas down. Reports state that when confronted, he resisted arrest, damaging property and attempting to flee. But the escape was over. He was handcuffed, taken into custody, and transported back to Louisiana to face charges. And here is where I find the irony unbearable. The same man who once flaunted his every move online was now desperate to vanish. Yet every step of his escape was documented by cameras and technology he could never outrun. The cross-state chase cemented the narrative. This was not an accident, nor a misunderstanding. It was a violent crime followed by a calculated attempt to flee. From internet celebrity to fugitive, Mr. Prada's downfall had become national news. What began as a shocking arrest soon escalated into a legal storm, with charges stacking higher by the day. When Terrion, Mr. Prada Thomas, was transported back to Louisiana, the first wave of charges came quickly. Prosecutors filed for second-degree murder, the most immediate and pressing count in connection to the death of Dr. William Nick Abraham. Alongside it were additional accusations: unauthorized use of Abraham's vehicle, resisting arrest in Texas, and property damage. Each charge painted a clearer picture of a man spiraling out of control, trying to cover his tracks while only leaving behind more evidence of guilt. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Reporters filled the benches, eager to document every word, every glimpse of the TikTok star now shackled and silent. Gone was the confident online persona. In its place sat a young man in a jail-issued jumpsuit, staring blankly ahead. For many, the fall from flashy influencer to accused murderer was staggering. Behind the scenes, investigators compiled their findings. Blood evidence tied the violent struggle directly to Thomas's apartment. The tarp, the surveillance videos, and the victim's car all converged into an airtight case. The narrative seemed undeniable. Mr. Prada had lured Abraham in, killed him, tried to cover the crime, and fled. But legal cases are rarely straightforward. Thomas's defense began hinting at a strategy involving his mental health, suggesting his bipolar disorder played a significant role in the tragedy. It was a subtle but calculated attempt to shift the story, planting seeds of doubt in the public's mind. And here, I can't help but remark, this is where true crime always complicates itself. Was it cold-blooded calculation? Or was it a mind unraveling under the weight of illness? For now, prosecutors stood firm. The evidence was too damning, the crime too brutal. As the initial charges were read, one thing became clear. This case was far from over. And what began as second-degree murder could soon take a far darker turn. What began as a charge of second-degree murder soon escalated into something far more severe. An accusation that carried the weight of death itself. In the weeks following Thomas's arrest, prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury. The evidence was laid out meticulously. Blood pooled across the apartment floor, surveillance footage showing the victim entering but never leaving, and the chilling sight of Thomas hauling a tarp-wrapped body into the parking lot. Add to that his flight across state lines in Abraham's stolen vehicle. And the picture was grim. The grand jury deliberated, considering not just the brutality of the killing, but the intent behind it. Second-degree murder implied a killing without premeditation, a crime of passion or sudden rage. But the level of violence, the cleanup attempts, and the calculated disposal of the body pointed towards something darker. To them, it looked like intent. The verdict was swift. Thomas would face first-degree murder. The stakes changed instantly. With this upgrade, Thomas was no longer simply looking at decades behind bars. He was staring at the possibility of life without parole, or even the death penalty under Louisiana law. Courtroom whispers echoed the gravity of the decision. Supporters of the victim saw it as justice. Supporters of Thomas felt it was an overreach, considering his young age and alleged mental health struggles. Yet the law was clear. First-degree murder was reserved for the most heinous of crimes. And prosecutors believed this case fit that category. Thomas himself appeared shaken when informed of the change. No longer did his face hold the same blank detachment. Instead, there was a flicker of fear, a rare crack in the once flamboyant persona. And this is where my own thoughts sharpen. When the law raises the charge to first degree, it is declaring to the world that this was not an accident, but an execution. The case had officially transformed. What started as a shocking crime was now a potential capital trial, one that could determine not just guilt, but whether Mr. Prada would live or die behind prison walls. When the charges were read aloud in court, all eyes turned to the young influencer, waiting for the words that could shape his fate. On January 28, 2025, Terrion, Mr. Prada Thomas was led into a Baton Rouge courtroom for his arraignment. Cameras flashed, pens scratched against reporters' notepads, and the quiet murmur of anticipation filled the room. For weeks, the public had speculated. Would he admit guilt, or attempt to fight the mountain of evidence stacked against him? When asked for his plea, Thomas spoke clearly, "Not guilty." Those two words cut through the courtroom like a blade. To prosecutors, it was defiance. To his supporters, It was a glimmer of hope to the broader public. It was yet another twist in a case already steeped in tragedy. His defense attorneys wasted no time outlining their strategy. They hinted that Thomas's mental health, particularly his diagnosis of bipolar disorder, would play a central role in his case. They painted a picture of a young man overwhelmed by psychological turmoil, someone incapable of forming the intent required for a first-degree murder conviction. The prosecution, however, dismissed this narrative. They pointed to the evidence: the violent struggle, the blood-soaked apartment, the tarp, the body dumped by the roadside, and the cross-state escape. These were not the actions of someone who lost control for a fleeting moment, they argued, but of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Spectators inside the courtroom could feel the divide. Some sympathized with Thomas, a 20-year-old whose life had veered into darkness. Others focused solely on Abraham, the 69-year-old therapist whose final moments were marked by violence and fear. And I can't help but think here, in true crime cases, a plea of innocence doesn't erase the evidence. It only sets the stage for an even more brutal legal battle. With his plea entered, the trial loomed ahead. The story of Mr. Prada was no longer confined to TikTok fame or tabloid headlines. It was now a question of whether he would ever walk free again. The trial has yet to begin, but already this case has left behind more questions than answers. As of early 2025, the story of Terrion, Mr. Prada Thomas, remains unfinished, with his plea of not guilty. The case now moves toward what could become one of the most closely watched trials in Louisiana. Prosecutors prepare to argue for first-degree murder, armed with an overwhelming collection of physical evidence. The defense readies its counter, shaping a narrative around mental illness, youth, and the claim that Thomas lacked the intent to kill. For the family and friends of Dr. William Nick Abraham, the wait for justice is painful. They grapple with the reality of his violent death, a stark contrast to the man they knew as a respected therapist. To them, this was a senseless killing that deserves the harshest punishment. Meanwhile, the public remains divided. Supporters of Thomas highlight his age, just 20, and point to his erratic behavior online as signs of deeper struggles. Others argue that no amount of psychological explanation can justify the brutality of what happened inside that Baton Rouge apartment. The media continues to fuel the debate. Headlines paint him as either a fallen influencer who snapped or a cold-blooded killer who carefully covered his tracks. On social media, the same platforms that once celebrated his flashy persona now buzz with speculation about his downfall. And my personal thought here is sobering. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the crime itself, but the way it blurs lines between fame and infamy, victim and predator, illness and intent. For now, Mr. Prada waits in a jail cell, far from the glittering life he once portrayed to millions online. The trial ahead will decide not only his guilt, but also his fate, whether he spends the rest of his life behind bars or faces an even harsher sentence. Until that verdict arrives, the strange case of Mr. Prada remains suspended in uncertainty, a story without its final chapter.